Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show. I'm here with Ron Placone.
Howdy, howdy, Jimmy.
And we thought two white guys would talk to you about Martin Luther King on Martin Luther King Day. So here's what I love. I love he says such great stuff. What this is going to talk about the parts of Martin Luther King that people don't talk about. Right? Colin Kaepernick tweeted this out. I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. That's MLK. The Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate. Sounds very much like the message we've been saying on this show. The true enemy of progressives is not the neocon conservative right wing or Ku Klux Klan or anybody. It's the corporate Democrat, the moderate.
Mm-hmm.
Who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season? The white moderate, who consistently advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. That's what they do to progressives, right? With progressives, they go, you guys want everything all at once. There's no magic dust. It's got a little bit. That's what he's saying, that incrementalism is bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
And he says shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. That's a great quote.
It is.
So I want to jump to this. This was it's another quote from Martin Luther King. Again, we have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, both here and abroad. And that's why they really killed him. When he really started to go against the Vietnam War and stand up against capitalism is when his days were short. Civil rights is fine as long as your civil rights fits into the package of capitalism, right, and war. So this is from The Intercept. Zaid Jilani, is that how you say his name? I think so. He wrote this. What is the Santa classification? What the Santa classification of Martin Luther King Jr. leaves out? He goes, this Santa classification of King, as scholar Cornel West calls it, the portrayal of King as a celebrated consensus seeker asking for common sense racial reforms rather than as an anti-establishment radical, which is what he was.
Mm-hmm.
It downplays the risks one of America's most revered activists took to live according to conscience. So our story of Martin Luther King Jr. has always been he just worked for civil rights, and I was obviously wrong, and you could see it. But when the other stuff they gloss over. King was not just a fighter for racial justice, he also fought for economic justice and against war. And as a result, he spent the last years of his life before being assassinated in 1968 clashing not just with reactionary Southern segregationists, but with the Democratic Party elite.
Mm-hmm.
Just like anybody who sticks up for anyone left behind by capitalism. That's what they'll do. They'll smear you. Anybody who stands up against war, they're smearing Chelsea Manning right now, the Democrats, because Chelsea Manning's running for Senate. So there it is. He was not just clashing with reactionary Southerners, but also the Democratic Party elite and other civil rights leaders who viewed his turn against the Vietnam War and the American economic system as dangerous and radical. So we're anti-war and we're pointing out the brutalities of capitalism and how capitalism effed up. So we'll never be the darlings of establishment press. We're always going to be a pariah that they're always going to try and spin us as a kook or the radicals who you can't listen to or don't know how things work. That's what they did to Bernie Sanders. We're Russians, we're communists, we're Putin puppets. That's what they do. That's what they do to the people who are truly left. So there's a little more to this. Many in the civil rights community warned King to focus on black civil rights and ignore the war as to not alienate the Democratic Party. He gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York City. This is the speech. That was the speech that really put him on the other side of the Democrats. He gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York City where he called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. and denounced napalm bombings and propping up of a puppet government in South Vietnam. He also called for a total re-examination of U.S. foreign policy, questioning capitalist exploitation of the developing world. And then they killed him. And that's not funny, but that's when they killed him. That's when it's like, you're going to get people to go against the war and capitalism? You're going to show the brutality? No. Well, here's some of his speech that night. For those who asked the question, quote, aren't you a civil rights leader and thereby mean to exclude me from the movement for peace, I have this further answer. In 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Council, we chose as our motto, quote, to save the soul of America, end quote. We were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for black people, but instead affirm the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself until the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear. Now, it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the hopes of men the world over. So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be, are led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of our land. That's super controversial. That was super controversial when he said that, and he told those, I'm not just for black civil rights, I'm for the rights of everyone. King had long considered himself a socialist. In 1966, he told staff at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that there must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward democratic socialism. Call it what you may, call it a democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all of God's children. That's what MLK said. You can see why they killed him, right, Ron?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's this popular misconception that, you know, like that again, like a lot of things that are glossed over, where we're kind of taught this thing where MLK was the guy that kind of like, yeah, we want civil rights, but we're going to kind of play it the company way, whereas Malcolm X was the more,
yeah.
And that's not actually true. There were a lot of parallels in both of their messages that also had messages of peace, also had messages of socialism and in other injustices in the world that is often glossed over.
So there's a little more to this. The last years of King's life saw him escalate his campaign against economic inequality. He campaigned against the Oklahoma right-to-work referendum and warned that increased economic competition between whites and blacks would undermine civil rights, calling instead for a grand alliance between working-class whites and blacks. Sounds like something Bernie Sanders was saying.
Mm-hmm.
You see what they got to demean that guy from the corporate left? He sought to use many of the same tactics he deployed in the South: boycotts, sit-ins, blockades against economic injustice in inner cities in the North, where African Americans were trapped in endemic poverty. An article from the August 15th, 1967 issue of the New York Times writes up King's desire to, quote, dislocate large cities to force them to address these needs. The editorial board of the liberal New York Times was less than pleased with Dr. King's choice of tactics. The Times called the proposed campaign a formula for discord. This is the New York Times going against Martin Luther King. And they warned against mass civil disobedience. The New York Times, don't do it. Don't do this stuff. Writing that, quote, once the spark of massive law defiance is applied in the present overheated atmosphere, the potentiality for disaster becomes overwhelming. You can't speak up too loudly for equality. Don't speak up too loudly for equality, because if you do, shit's going to hit the fan. Meaning we're going to have the cops come crack your heads. We might have to call in the National Guard to crack your head. There's going to be a lot of head cracking. That's what they're saying. King was assassinated before he was able to set up the encampment called Resurrection City. His widow, Coretta Scott King, as well as fellow civil rights leader David Abernathy, went ahead with the plan. The camp lasted 6 weeks until police moved in to shut it down and evict all of its inhabitants, pointing to sporadic acts of hooliganism as justification, like they did to
I was going to
Occupy
say
Wall
that
Street.
this sounds familiar. Yeah.
So please, you can't overstate how out in front he was against the war and how people were against him being against the war. Only 9% of the country agreed with King's being against. They were against him coming out against the war. That was a big deal when he did that. So this can't be overstated. Andrew Young, the young civil rights leader who later went on to be Jimmy Carter's UN ambassador and mayor of Atlanta, was horrified, saying the crushing of the camp was worse than the police violence he saw in the South. So just so you know, that's when shit really hit the fan for Martin Luther King Jr., was when he came out against inequality and capitalism and the war. Everyone turned on him. It's a great article. We'll put a link to it underneath here. It's a great article. You can read the whole thing. Were you aware of that, Ron? That's because you only get this Santa Claus version of Martin Luther King, of him being this, jolly guy who only cared about black civil rights. But no, he really challenged the establishment in many more ways than just that.
Yeah, I mean, I was taught, like I said earlier, I was taught that, Martin Luther King was kind of just, civil rights are a good thing, but, of course, nonviolence. And, of course, he was all about nonviolence. But all of these other critiques that he had, all these other, big parts and all the connections that he made, inequality and stuff like that, that all, that's never taught to you in school, or at least it certainly was not taught to me. I didn't find out about that until much later in adulthood. When
he started talking against the Vietnam War, everybody's like, hey, don't do it. It's the same stuff they say to Bernie. The New York Times came out. So every liberal, and that's why, we're progressives and not liberals, just so you know. So if you want to know why I'm not a liberal, listen to Phil Oak's song about Love Me, I'm a Liberal. But this is another reason why, because the liberals turned on him when he wanted to make real change. When he wanted to challenge the system, the one that had rewarded them. And they're like, no, easy, buddy. And plus the war's cool. We're always pro-war in this country.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that's a great... that's the side of Martin Luther King that's super relevant today. And, of course... I haven't watched the coverage of Martin Luther King on MSNBC or CNN, but I'm going to guess they don't talk about this part. I'm going to guess this is the part about that. Maybe that should be the title for this video. The MLK, MSNBC, and CNN won't talk about.
There you go. Yeah,
his anti-war. I'm telling you, everybody came out against him. The New York Times came out against him. The press came out against him. The Democrats came out against him. They had to stop talking against the war and capitalism.
Well, and also like the manner in which like the corporate media, squashes anti-war movements. I mean, that whole template really started with Vietnam, and they use it to present. It has not changed one iota.
When they came after Occupy, it's because there's all these, there's drugs and stuff happening in New York City. Mm-hmm. And it's not an FBI guy pretending to be an Occupy guy creating unrest and fights and drugs. No, it couldn't be that. Anyway, so there you go. That's the part. So people, I'd like to look more into it. This is a great article, and but just know that as soon as they start talking against war, there's no one leading an anti-war and not one politician. Remember when Barack Obama got elected in 2008, Barney Frank, who's in the pocket of Wall Street, even him back then was like, hey, we need to reduce the Pentagon budget by, let's say, 25%. Remember that? You don't hear anybody saying that now. And Barack Obama said, you shut up with that. I'm in the pocket of the military-industrial complex and Wall Street, and we are ramping up the budget. And they did.
Oh, yeah, they smeared him big time when he did that.
So God bless Barack Obama for ramping up the military budgets, taking 2 wars to 7. And of course, they killed him as soon as Martin Luther King started talking about this stuff. So there you go. That's the part of Martin Luther King's story you won't hear on MSNBC tonight. If they do, let me know. We'll give them a tip of the hat. Please make sure you're subscribed, even if you think you are, and come see our next live show, February 16th. That's a Friday in Burbank, California. Links for tickets right there.